y'all, welcome back to my channel. For all of you who this is your first time seeing me, welcome to the Survivor's Guide to Life. I am Jessica Lang and I talk about all things trauma related, mental health related, but the focus specifically on my channel is all about trauma. And my hope is that the content I give you on this channel kind of gives you a little bit more insight into why you behave in some of the ways you do, or you have a partner who's a survivor of trauma, how you can kind of help them understand what's going on inside their body when they have these big trauma reactions and how you can best support them. The biggest goal for me is that you just are learning and able to apply some of this knowledge to better your life. So without further ado, I don't want to say that. Since it's the new year and we've all set goals, well, not all of us, but most of us have set goals and New Year's resolutions about how to be a better person or how to improve our lives, I thought, why not contribute to that, support you by uploading a new video every day that will help you along in your journey, whatever that is for you. So yesterday I just did a brief intro, talked a little bit about the brain and about kind of why change is so hard and how it triggers the stress response system. And so today I'm going to just talk a little more overview about the brain, but also kind of how you can tell when you're actually in your trauma reaction, and give you 3 tips for how you can kind of combat or tackle that so that you're feeling more in control and you're better able to manage those big feelings. So the reason I'm starting this series with talking about the brain is because the brain is this powerful organism that is pretty much responsible for everything. And one of the things with the new year is that we want to make these changes, but you feel like you're self-sabotaging. And part of this sabotaging has to do with the brain and the way it's wired. So the brain develops in a sequential fashion, right? And it starts in utero. So we start with the brainstem, goes up to the diencephalon, then you got your limbic system, and then you got the top part, which is the biggest part, the cortex. Talk about the lower parts of your brain. I'm talking about your brainstem, the diencephalon, and your limbic system. So these are largely out of your control. So the one you kind of have the most amount of control over in terms of action steps you can take is your cortex. Starting off with the brainstem starts developing in utero. So when you're in your mom's belly, I don't want to geek out. Oh well, I'll geek out a little bit. The mechanisms that are put into place for regulating your body temperature, regulating your heartbeat, what am I forgetting? Regulating your metabolism. All of that begins to develop in utero and continues throughout infancy and toddlerhood. Next is the diencephalon, is the part that is more responsible for your nervous system and your endocrine system, but it's also where the movement piece happens. So the way your body moves in space, that happens with the diencephalon. That starts developing in infancy and again throughout toddlerhood. Then you have your limbic system. Again, this is the emotional center of the brain. It's developing in infancy. You see it real big time in toddlerhood and also in adolescence when you have an influx of new hormones. But this is basically the mechanism that's largely responsible for emotions and feelings. Then you have your cortex, which of course it's the biggest piece. It's the part that's where you're most easily able to kind of change things around, whereas the lower parts, because they're more primitive and they develop early and they kind of max out or finish developing earlier in life, so within that first 5 years, what you kind of have developed up to that point kind of sticks. And that's where a lot of like the trauma symptoms, especially the early stuff, the attachment stuff, it gets embedded in those lower parts. And so with us therapists who do more body and mind work, that's the area we're targeting, because you don't actually have the language, which is up here in the cortex, to kind of describe what's going on or how you're feeling and how this link goes to that. Because it's all kind of embedded in there. Being able to kind of recognize what's happening in your body and then using your cortex, the part that is like the rational abstract part of your brain, to what we could say mediate or kind of control those other functions, or to make meaning about those other functions, is kind of the hallmark of a bottom-up approach, as opposed to the top-down, where like CBT, where you're just talking about what's going on and you're trying to almost, I call it, will yourself to behave differently, which largely ignores some of that, the lower parts of the brain, which are responsible for like the more physical stuff. What the frontal cortex is, it's developing all along, right? Starts developing early, just like the others, but it maximizes its development, or it finishes developing around 25. It's 25 for women, 26 for males, generally. And so when you think about maybe how you behaved in your 20s versus how you are in your 30s, part of that is that you have more development, like the cortex is more developed, so it's better able to kind of curb the impulses, and that's what you're looking for the cortex to do, is to kind of curb those primitive brain stem, diencephalon, lower parts of the brain impulses that get triggered and activated when you are in a trauma reaction. What happens in your early childhood when you have any type of trauma? So there's the overt traumas, physical abuse, sexual abuse, but there's also emotional abuse, attachment related issues, so bouncing between caregivers or caregivers who are inattentive to your needs, which creates kind of more of an anxious attachment. And I'm not going to get all into that right now, but basically anything that your brain senses as a threat to your survival, it releases the stress response, it activates the stress response system, which then sends different signals throughout your brain, releases hormones. The hormones travel throughout your body, and a set of physiological changes happen throughout your body, and this leads to certain behaviors that you can see generally. So this is the fight, flight, freeze response, and the fight and the fight responses are kind of what we call more active movements, where when one of these mechanisms are triggered, flight or fight, you feel like a surge of energy as cortisol and adrenaline gets released throughout your body. You kind of focus in on your target, you feel more energy, your muscles might feel a little more tense, your heart beats a little faster, you might start to sweat or feel really hot. Those are just kind of like the big ones that most people feel, and then there's some other little subtle things, but those are the big ones that people feel. And it's your body believes, hey, this is a threat, but I can use some type of physical movement to optimize my survival. So this could be fighting. So if you are bigger than the person or the threat, then you can overpower it. Whereas if you are smaller but you still think, hey, I'm faster, you can outrun it. On the flip, you have freeze, which is more of an immobilizing response. And this is what happens for small children. I mean, this can happen anywhere, but I'm talking about kind of those early trauma experiences like that happened in the first 5 years. The adult is bigger, more powerful. They're harming you in some sort of way. It's causing the stress response system to signal this is a threat, and there's no way you can use movement to get rid of this threat. So it prepares for the assault. So rather than having cortisol and adrenaline get released throughout your body, what actually gets released are the endorphins. So they kind of act more like sedatives, or kind of that they make you feel good in a sense, because basically your body's preparing to be assaulted, and so it's minimizing the amount of pain you're going to experience as you experience this threat that you cannot escape from. And these things happen on an impulsive, evolutionary, reflexive basis. You cannot control what response is going to happen. It happens too fast. And if you're in danger, you don't really want the cortex jumping in there and saying, well, maybe let me do this, and like, you don't need that reasoning part. You need that part to be shut down, and for the eye, the nose, like all this information coming in from your five senses that gets mixed in there with your internal stuff, to act quickly, to maximize the potential for you to survive. That's literally what's happening when the stress response system becomes activated. So when you've experienced a trauma early in life, or multiple traumas, what your brain does is it's all the time scanning the environment for things that are threats and things that are safe. And so if you had early experiences of trauma, then your brain becomes sensitive to anything that resembles that traumatic experience. So it sends off the alarm bells, goes, oh, I know what this experience is. I know how to take care of that, puts it in the threat category, and it's off to the races. It's out of your control. So one of the things that survivors of trauma struggle with is that their past and their present get kind of conflated. So maybe their boss is, giving them, maybe on their, what do you call it? Oh, on their eval said, they need to work on being more hardworking. And that's a criticism. Your brain links that criticism to maybe past criticisms, emotional abuse from your parents, that made you feel like you were unloved, or you weren't good enough. And these are all things that kind of, because they're related to attachment, feel like a threat, like the loss of something, abandonment, the removal of kind of that care. That's kind of what that signals into the threat category. And so even though it's your boss having this conversation, your body remembers this experience, puts it in the threat category, and now the stress response system kicks in, and you're reacting. Either you're shutting down, or you become argumentative or combative, and the fight response kicks in. I mean, it's different. It's different for different people, but that's just kind of like a small but kind of typical reaction that people have, and that you can kind of link that back to those early experiences of trauma that get embedded. That get embedded into your system. So what can you do about this, right? How do you kind of tackle those impulsive, reflexive moments where your brain is conflating something in your environment that is a threat, or it activates that threat response, but it's really not a trauma, or it's not a sense of like a threat to your safety or your survival. It's just something that makes you feel uncomfortable. So basically what we're talking about here is rewiring your brain, or forming new connections based on different experiences that you now have as an adult. So one of the things you need to do is you need to slow down that process. Give your cortex enough time to come back online to be able to say, wait a minute, this here is a different experience. It's not that experience that you are familiar with. Yes, it has some, similar flavors. It's got a little bit of the same smell, but it's not that. And we don't need to go full throttle and go into the stress response system because survival is not at stake. Tip number one is, and it's also the hardest, is to learn your body. This will take some time, because for most trauma survivors, they feel really uncomfortable in their body, especially if you're a sexual abuse survivor. You don't necessarily trust your body. It's betrayed you in some way. You feel unsafe in your body. You feel uncomfortable in your body. And so taking the time to get to know what's going on in your body, how you know when you're feeling calm, what's the difference between calm and anxious and angry and afraid, right? Being able to kind of discern what all of that is and how it feels in your body. What's great for things like this is trauma sensitive yoga, which I'll link in the bio. I talked with a colleague / friend of mine who she does trauma sensitive yoga, and she actually walks me through kind of an experience of what she does in her class. So I think that's a really good video to take a look at if you're trying to get reconnected with your body, on how to find a really good practitioner, but how it can actually help you feel more connected to your body, so you're not dissociating, which happens when you're in that freeze response. Trauma-informed acupuncture. I've worked with occupational therapists, especially when I'm doing work with children, because they really don't have the same type of language, and they can't put the same type of meaning because of their because of where they are in development, as an adult can, in terms of kind of processing the trauma. And so a lot of that type of work is going to be more body-based, sensory-based, and I really like working with occupational therapists who are in the mental health field and know how to tie in the two. So for most of my adult, so my two big recommendations are to get reconnected with your bodies, to find a sensitive yoga instructor and work with them, or an occupational therapist who works with trauma survivors. Tip number 2 is to learn grounding techniques. So this is to slow your body down. You activate the 5 senses grounding technique, and that's naming 5 things that you see. You name 4 things, and as you're doing it, feel them. 4 things you can touch or you can feel. These last ones I kind of play around with, but it might be 3 things that you can smell in your environment, or 3 things you can hear, or 2 things that you can hear, or 3 things that you can hear. So it just depends. You might do 2 hearing or 3 hearing, and then 1 thing that you can taste. And what that does, and if you can do kind of slow breaths as you do it, that slows down that trauma reaction. Like, gives the cortex enough time to come online and say you're safe, you're okay, your survival is not at risk. Like, whatever kinds of message needs to come along to kind of talk you down and to get you from that, out of that past, that feeling of being in the past, to being more in the present. And tip number 3 is to kind of have a plan. So when you are in a calm state, kind of mapping out what kinds of things tend to trigger you. What are the things that send you going off into a spiral, into the trauma reaction? Is it a certain smell? Is it men? Whatever it is, it might run the gamut. But you start to kind of identify what your triggers are, and then you can create a plan that you would practice, and on how you can take care of yourself, and for how you can safely avoid some of those things that are triggering, or how you can kind of breathe through it when you are reminded of that past trauma. But these are just 3 tips that I think are really helpful, that you can start to practice on your own. So there you have it. Those are some basic tips on how you can start your sensitized brain. And of course, I want to hear from you. So comment down below and let me know what you think about this video. Have you ever found yourself caught up in the stress response system? What are the things that you use to help you? If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up. If you are somebody who's experienced trauma, any type of trauma, and you're looking for healing and recovering, I really encourage you to reach out to a licensed mental health professional who specializes in trauma and traumatic symptoms. So feel free, if you are one of those people who are struggling, to send me an email, reach out. I can see what I can do to help you, and I'll see you in the next one.